Idaho Matters podcast is brought to you by St. Luke's On-Demand Virtual Care, which allows patients to see a provider from their home using a computer or smartphone with on-demand care for common ailments, such as a cough, sore throat, or a sinus issue. More information at stlukesonline.org. From Boundary to Bear Lake, Fremont to Payette, Oahe to Oneida, there are interesting people, places, and histories in all of Idaho's counties. And Idaho Matters wants to share it with you with stories from all 44 counties that make up the Gem State. Email your ideas to idahomatters@boisestate.edu or use the Talk to Us feature in our app, available on Apple and Android, and tune in each weekday at noon for Idaho Matters. From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. You're listening to Idaho Matters. This week marks 60 years since the Voting Rights Act was signed into law. Now, while much of the spotlight often falls on the South, the law's impact reached all corners of the country, including right here in Idaho. What many folks may not know is that Idaho's own constitution once required voters to read and speak English, a barrier that, while less overt than literacy tests that were used in the South, was still struck down by the VRA. And now, 6 decades later, there are new debates over voter access, and they are once again taking center stage here in our state, with proposals ranging from stricter ID laws to tighter registration deadlines. So joining us now to talk more about all of this is Idaho House Minority Leader, Representative Alana Rubel. Really nice to have you back on the program. So, Representative, this week, as I mentioned, marks 60 years since the Voting Rights Act was signed into law. I'm curious about what that milestone means to you in particular as a legislator in our state.
Yeah, I mean, it was, it was an incredibly seminal development in American history, really. It was probably the most effective piece of civil rights legislation in the history of the country. It was a massive increase in voter registrations and turnout, and really resulted in very concrete outcomes in terms of increases in education funding and all sorts of services in areas that had been disenfranchised before, and certainly had an impact on Idaho. As you noted, it overrode the literacy tests and whatnot that Idaho had that were largely excluding immigrants and Native Americans and others. So while I am joyful that the Voting Rights Act happened 60 years ago, I am deeply concerned about a lot of the backtracking that I'm seeing both nationwide and in Idaho. Every year in Idaho, it's a drag down fight to try to preserve reasonable ballot access. I mean, we are just in there facing off against one after another attempt to dramatically scale back voting in Idaho, and some of them have gone through and have had some pretty dire effects on voter turnout and participation.
So, in recent session, we've seen a push for tighter voting laws here in Idaho, as you mentioned, from stricter voter ID requirements to even shorter registration windows. What do you think is driving this trend? Because we're not just seeing it in Idaho.
Yeah, I mean, there's the language that surrounds it, and then there's what I fear is the actual intent driving it, which is somewhat speculative on my part, but I think not all that speculative. I mean, the language surrounding it is always voter integrity, voter integrity, voter integrity. We have to crack down and make sure there's no fraud in our elections. And then every time we press on that and say, well, is there fraud in our elections? Is there any evidence whatsoever? We're always told, no, we have incredibly secure elections with, vanishingly small levels of fraud already. So, it was a little unclear that there was actual fraud that was being targeted by these efforts. There have been so many, every single year we see efforts to basically end absentee voting, to ban drop boxes, to, really dramatically limit who and how people can vote. Some of them we've managed to defeat. We've managed to preserve absentee voting, which has been really a great help to people who work and have a hard time getting there on election day. We've managed to preserve early voting, but some of the things that have gone through have really scaled back voter participation, particularly among the very young and the very old. So there was a law that did pass that dramatically changed the kind of identification that you need to prove your residency. They banned student IDs from being used, and they restricted the types that you can use and said, you have to have a property tax bill or a lease, and a driver's license at your current address. Well, a lot of students don't have those things. They may have six people all living together, and the electric bill's in one person's name, and so that might mean the other five people can't vote. And a lot of students don't get driver's licenses issued to their dorm address that they're only going to be at for 8 months. So, by way of example, I did some poking around University of Idaho and looked at the turnout levels for voting age people in the three precincts that cover the University of Idaho. In 2020, it was 78%. The Idaho legislature passed this slew of laws surrounding what type of IDs you can use, banning student IDs, et cetera. It dropped from 78% to 33.6% in 2024. So that's a pretty stunning drop. I mean, well over half were knocked out of the voting pool, essentially, by these laws that Idaho's legislature passed. We've really seen some scaling back of franchise rights in Idaho.
So those are big numbers. I'm curious about what impact you think these laws that are in place here in Idaho have on civic engagement and turnout, in particular in local or off-year elections, because we always know election turnout is better during a presidential election cycle.
Right. So those numbers I just gave you were the high watermark, which is pretty terrifying. We were trying to compare apples to apples. So we were looking at presidential years. So from 2020 to 2024, we saw student turnout effectively drop from 78% to 33%. And that's in a presidential year. So, we're going to see what happens next year, but I think it's going to be way below 33% because, as you noted, it's usually lower in the non-presidential years.
Mm-hmm.
So there was effectively just an eradication of student voting in Idaho. And it doesn't just hit students, it hits older folks too. A lot of people who are seniors may not have an up-to-date driver's license at their current address. They may not drive anymore. They may be living with a family member who, pays their electric bill or pays their mortgage, and so they don't have that in their name. I always use my mother as an example. Born in the United States, never committed a felony, legal citizen her whole life. She would not have been able to vote under Idaho's current laws because I paid her rent and I paid her utilities. So she would not have been able to produce the kind of documentation the legislature now requires. And so, you look at the groups that this is hitting. I don't know if this was a plan to hit more left-leaning groups. I was on a panel once with the chairman of the State Affairs Committee and threw some of these numbers out at him, and he answered that these laws did exactly what they were intended to do. And he said that in his view, students should not be voting, that if they're just going to be in the community for a few years and they're not paying taxes in that community, then they shouldn't be voting. So, he thought it was great that we had effectively shut them out from voting. Makes me sad. I like to, young people have their whole lives ahead of them, and I think they need to be weighing in on government issues.
So, what protections or reforms would you like to see to strengthen voting rights here in Idaho?
Well, the Voting Rights Act was a tremendous achievement, but it was gutted in a very large degree by the Supreme Court in a series of rulings in recent years, where the Supreme Court basically said, it's okay if, changes to voting requirements and these super stringent documentation requirements come in. The Supreme Court said you don't even need to have any proof that there's any fraud whatsoever that you're cracking down on. You can just say, well, hypothetically, there may be somebody someday who commits fraud, so we can knock, 100,000 people out from voting based on the theory that one person may in the future vote fraudulently, which the Supreme Court has blessed. That basically said you can disenfranchise lots of people based on a hypothetical fraud scenario. So I would love to see, some fixes, certainly at the federal level, to really restore the teeth of the Voting Rights Act so that you can't just have these willy-nilly rules that I think are often pretty deliberately targeted. So, for example, at least historically, students have leaned a little bit more democratic. So student IDs were banned in Idaho, but gun permits are still a permissible form of identification. So, I'm not sure what the rationale is there on, why a gun permit is a more reliable form of ID than a student ID, other than that these have all been kind of gerrymandered rules to favor certain groups from voting over others. I think that's inappropriate. I think that we should be very even-handed, and if there's an ID out there that that shows your name, shows your whatever you need to know. It should be accepted, and it should not be carved up based on what types of people have what types of IDs.
Do you think that there is any type of path forward for bipartisan agreement on protecting or expanding access to the ballot box?
I would certainly hope there is. I mean, it's. I think the axe that was taken to Idaho voting was so extreme. Perhaps it was originally done with some sort of partisan agenda in mind. I can't vouch for that, but that seemed to be my impression. But I think it hit a lot of folks they weren't wanting to hit. I think it. I think lots and lots of Republicans were hit by these laws. There are lots of Republican folks living in senior centers and frankly
Mm-hmm.
students who are not able to pony this up. So this really has bipartisan impact in terms of disenfranchising people. I would hope we really all want young people getting invested in our democracy and coming out and voting for the people that are going to form their futures. I think there are some key players in the legislature right now who are just very hostile to fixing things. But if leadership changes, I think there would be a path for bipartisan collaboration on opening things up again. And, I think we can do so without any meaningful risk of fraud. We have super robust fraud protections that the Secretary of State implements that really don't require the kind of documentation that the legislature has put into effect.
Well, in fact, our Secretary of State is a Republican, and he's been lauded across the country, even on the federal level, for having incredibly secure elections.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I suspect he would be supportive of opening up our voting a little bit more. I mean, we used to have a system where you could just register to vote with your name and the last four digits of your social security number. And that was plenty to make sure that people were citizens, that they were here, that they were not voting in multiple states. They had all kinds of software that would compare across states to make sure the same people weren't voting twice. It was really a very good system. And it did everything we needed it to do. And then it was totally overhauled. And now, unless you have a property tax bill or something, which a lot of people don't have, or very specific forms of documentation, you can't register to vote anymore. And that is just, I think, completely unnecessary and frankly not tied to preventing fraud in any way. It's just a very arbitrary barrier that we have in Idaho that is blocking a lot of people and the overwhelming majority of young people from voting.
As we mark the 60th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, we're seeing some echoes of that same fight today. I want to talk about Texas for a moment because lawmakers have broken quorum to stop what they say are gerrymandered, discriminating redistricting maps. I am curious how you view those actions through the lens of the VRA's legacy.
I mean, absolutely. I am in awe of what the Texas Democrats are doing, and I hope they don't end up arrested and thrown behind bars for trying to stand up for their constituents. This is just an attempt to steal the election. Gerrymandering is a way to make sure that voters are not adequately represented. And you can do remarkable things with gerrymandering when you draw up these maps. It's pretty amazing. I mean, you can take 45% of the vote and turn it into 90% of the seats and effectively disenfranchise a majority of voters through really crafty gerrymandering. And that is what they're trying to do in Texas. Happily, we don't have that in Idaho right now, although that is one of the many efforts that are afoot. They want to eradicate our current bipartisan redistricting system and
Mm-hmm.
turn it into a party controlled redistricting system so that Idaho would be open to the kind of gerrymandering we're seeing in Texas right now. That's one of the many, many battles we'll be fighting. But I think it's shutting this down in Texas would be incredibly important if they could do it. But the Supreme Court, again, has blessed partisan gerrymandering. They have said, have at it. We're not getting involved. Do whatever you want. And so now we're seeing this, global nuclear warfare with Texas, with New York jumping to the table and Illinois, and it's just concerning. It's going to be this nationwide trend if we can't stop it of just wild gerrymandering and voter will being undermined. And that was really what the Voting Rights Act was about. It was about protecting the vote and making sure that people's vote matters, that votes matter equally, that everybody has a chance to participate and to cast their vote. And there are many sneaky ways to undermine that. I mean, one of them was kind of Jim Crow literacy laws, et cetera. But, certainly another way is gerrymandering. Another way is the kind of ID laws we have in Idaho that block so many people from the ballot. One of the things I'd like to see is motor voter. I've sponsored that bill a number of times to at least, you know, give people more of a fighting chance to register when they're getting their driver's license. But yeah, we are seeing every manner of assault on the ballot and on voter representation happening across the country, where folks just want to rig the system to get the policy outcome they want, whether that's what voters want or not.
Before I let you go, do you think that this anniversary adds any type of urgency or even moral weight to what's going on in Texas? And should other states be paying closer attention to what's going on? And I ask this because you mentioned New York, Illinois, even California, right? Saying, well, we have to fight fire with fire. Um,
Yeah.
and so I'm curious about your thoughts on this because, you can take the moral high ground, right? But I mean, where does that get you in the culture and climate we live in right now?
Exactly, and this is why it's right. Nobody wants to be the one bringing a nail file to a gunfight, as it were. So, I think that Illinois and California and New York would rather not be going down this path, but that the implications are national for sure. If Texas is in a position to completely rig the next Congress by virtue of doing a gerrymander in their state, you can kind of understand how other states are like, well, we can't just sit back and let them do that. If we're all going to get in the gutter and this is going to be a knife fight in the gutter, I guess we better grab a knife and get in the gutter. But this is where you need federal law, and frankly, you need Supreme Court participation in this, because we don't want this state by state race to the bottom. We want to live in a reasonable democracy with rules that apply across the country, so that no state can engage in these kind of low tactics of stealing the vote from voters, essentially, and rigging things so that you end up in a system where the majority will is not represented. This really is something that should be solved federally, because we're seeing exactly what happens when you get in this Hunger Games scenario of state versus state and everybody just seeing how dirty they can play. This is something that we should have coast to coast universal access and assurance of fair voting and fair representation. And that is what the
Well,
Voting
we should,
Rights Act was all about. And we've moved far too far away from it.
and to remember that it's supposed to be a government for the people and by the people.
Amen.
I want to thank you so much for joining us today and talking about this. We've been talking with Idaho House Minority Leader Representative Alana Rubel, talking about this week marking 60 years since the Voting Rights Act was signed into law. I'm Gemma Gaudette, and this is Idaho Matters.